Okay. Just let me know when I'm good to go.
Good to go.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I am James Cain. I'm part of the H2F, the Holistic Health and Fitness team at Fort Bliss here in Texas. I've been invited to talk about some nutrition topics. Yesterday, I gave a discussion about some nutrition guidelines and some strategies for managing body weight and body composition that will play a little bit of a role in today's talk. So I'm not going to focus on that a whole lot today, but that does obviously play a role in performance for physical performance and tactical athletes. But today's presentation, I'm going to focus on nutrition principles for enhancing physical performance. So we're just going to cover some basic nutrition guidelines, kind of set the foundation, and then talk about some more specific advanced topics throughout. So it'll be a little bit of everything, depending on where people are in their interest or their level. Hopefully, someone can find something interesting in this that directly applies to them, depending on whatever their goals might be. So we'll hop right in here. Cover some basic, kind of the basic principles first. So sports nutrition versus healthy eating for an active lifestyle. For a lot of people, if they're relatively active, but they're not necessarily athlete levels, and they don't have aspirations to be athlete level performance, a generally healthy diet with high food quality, getting adequate protein, eating a little bit throughout the day, will honestly get them most of the way there. Once you start getting into more athlete level performance, more serious, like, more than just 30 to 40 minutes a day, if you're actually trying to improve performance, modify body composition, and think about long-term success in any kind of physical endeavor, then sports nutrition principles can really help here. So let's hop into the sports nutrition pyramid. If we see here at the bottom, the basic diet is going to be minimally processed foods that really, I think, more whole foods. So eating, so let's say I got an example here. So eating the chicken instead of the chicken nuggets, apples instead of apple juice, apple pie, try to go for intact grains like oatmeal, rice, even if it's white rice, rather than something like dehydrated processed grains, and especially ones like chips, cookies, crackers, things that have added sugars and fats to them. So to an extent that someone can eat further on the left side of the spectrum, they're going to be overall better health, and generally that's going to transfer into performance as well. When we look at that middle part of the pyramid, we have more advanced concepts like nutrient and meal timing. So how many meals, when should I eat? How should I structure my day and my nutrition before, during, and after exercise or more competition level performances? Now, with soldiers, this is interesting because there isn't really an on-season and an off-season as much, and it's more of a consistent performance over time rather than peaking once a year during some championships. But these principles are still very applicable. They just have to be, that consideration has to be taken into mind. So it's sort of a year-long consideration rather than peaking at any given time. And then adding in special foods, so bars, powders, drinks, things that might help achieve specific nutrient recommendations. And we'll talk about those as we go. So I'm going to talk about energy, then protein, carbohydrates, fat recommendations, and then a little bit of specific nutrient and meal timing towards the end, and then finish with talking about supplements. So speaking of supplements, the very top of the pyramid, we have dietary supplements. And a lot of people, they go to GNC or their local nutrition supplement store, and they want to just get that quick fix or something that'll give them an edge. And while these can be helpful, they should supplement a well-planned diet. The actual performance benefit from the small number of supplements that actually work might be in the range of a few percent benefit. Whereas if you get just the basic diet right, you can get a 20 to 30% benefit over eating lower food quality and the suboptimal amounts of carbohydrates and proteins. So adding a few percent from a supplement on an inferior diet just doesn't really give as much bang for the buck. So this is one of the principles that a lot of people underestimate in a generally healthy diet for athletes. is reducing illness and downtime. This could be minor injuries, getting the flu, so to the extent that someone might miss training time, they're actually reducing the total number of workouts over time and their ability to adapt to those workouts. So as an extreme example of this, there's this great, almost like a case study where these researchers looked at 37 elite Norwegian cross-country skiers over 9 years of competition. 16 of those athletes won Olympic or World Championship medals, 11 did not. So what was the difference? Their training and pretty much most of the factors that might predispose them to illness and other things were pretty much the same. What was different was that the medal winners reported fewer symptomatic days from respiratory and gastrointestinal infections compared to the non-medal winners. So whether their lifestyle or diets either help, whatever they did to help themselves have a stronger immune system so that they had less downtime, that was the main factor that seemed to separate the medal winners from the non-medal winners. And now that's a very extreme example, going from say 98% to 100% of peak performance, but these principles are the same. If someone can reduce a week worth of downtime because of illness, then that's an extra week worth of adaptations that they can carry forward. It's kind of like investing. Whatever you invest, it's going to compound interest build year after year. And so the consistency of training is very important, and a high quality diet can help someone be able to train more consistently because of less downtime. So moving on to more sport specific applications nutrition wise, nutrition periodization is really important. It helps to match nutrition intake to the specific demands of a given day or a given week. So a lot of people think, this is my diet, I'm eating the same thing every day. Well, your training changes day by day, week by week, month by month, and that training periodization has to be matched to the type of fuel and the amount of fuel that you're giving yourself. So this is from the Warfighter Nutrition Guide. The military has adopted kind of a my plate type structure, where we see in the bottom left here, lean protein should make up about half the plates. Grains, a high carbohydrates vegetable or grain source, should be about a quarter of the plate. Vegetables are always in there, about a quarter of the plate. And then what you do with the other quarter is either going to be more vegetables to fill out that plate, in which case someone might not need as much energy on that day, or maybe if they're fueling up for the next day, considerations. If they had a workout and they've got an easy weekend, they don't really need to maximally refuel because they're going to have some downtime. Whereas if it's a harder training day, they should take this high carbohydrate food category and push that over, and to the extent that they need more fuel, they can get more of the high carbohydrate fuels and a little bit less in the way of vegetables. The idea is the volume of food stays pretty consistent, but the calorie density and the amount of carbohydrates varies depending on the needs. So this was adapted from the US Olympic Committee, and so this is their version. And so just to kind of go through this in a little more detail, they have hard, moderate, and easy training days. And what we see is that protein in the bottom left stays about the same regardless. There's always some vegetables, and then it's just what do we do with the high carbohydrate sources. On moderate days, a little bit less carbohydrates. On easy days, even less, and possibly for weight management, have a little bit of extra protein and a little bit less of the energy dense carbohydrates. And fats are not emphasized, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But if there's fat involved in the cooking of the carbohydrate or the vegetables, or it's part of the meat, then it may not need to be added. But otherwise, if all this is very lean and an athlete needs extra calories, they can certainly add some of these high quality fat sources as well. Generally try to avoid liquid calories unless someone really needs a lot of energy. So if someone's getting 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day because of a high energy expenditure, then maybe liquid calories are necessary. But really the quality of the food is going to matter. Assuming someone's in like a 2,000 to 3,000 calorie range, there shouldn't be an issue getting plenty of carbs, fats, proteins, and energy from whole food sources. So what does this look like in practice? A lot of people in general, including athletes, are moderately overweight. We usually say overfat because weight can be muscle mass. So for someone who's looking for an easy training day or kind of more weight management, more vegetables, less high carb, high fat foods, still with a good source of protein. And this is an example of what that might look like as half the plate vegetables with a serving of carbohydrates and a serving of a lean protein. Now, obviously, we get to shift the proportions and the food choices could stay the same. And if someone were to, now these are, a lot of people like to plan by having, for example, specifically a pile of vegetables, a piece of fruit, a pile of grains, and a piece of meat. But if someone wanted to mix those together, this is what that might look like. So if someone, cafeteria, even eating out, cooking at home, whatever the individual's main source of nutrition is, this is going to be pretty much emphasizing vegetables and fruits, and more intact grains and meats are going to be really helpful. All right, so let's actually go through and try to figure out how someone might think about how much energy they need, carbs, fat, and proteins on a more gram per day level. So for energy, I didn't do anything super specific here because it really depends on the individual. So in general, we will estimate the resting metabolic rate of the individual and then factor in the demands of their job. And a lot of soldiers have active jobs, some of them have more desk jobs. So just like the real world, you have to take that into consideration. Any kind of training, and are they doing strength and or endurance training as the bulk of their training at that given time? And then any kind of leisure activities. Some people are very active in their off time. So taking into account all those things, we just get a general ballpark of how many calories someone might need per day. You can kind of do an easier way, which is just the ballpark amounts of food. And then if they're gaining or losing weight, you just modify the amounts from there. That way there's no real need to count calories. Otherwise, some other considerations that are important is the second point here. Not every athlete should be very lean. A lot of athletes, soldiers included, there's this idea where I just want to get muscular and very lean and be very athletic looking. Now, for many individuals, losing excess body fat is very helpful. But if someone is extremely lean, that can be a problem if they're entering into periods of extended high energy cost training. So this could be really intense, prolonged field exercises, or especially special ops training schools. And individuals might benefit from having a little bit of extra stored body fat to avoid basically energy deficiency, which we'll talk about here in the next slide. As far as the sources of energy, minimally processed food should make up the majority of the intake. That's been shown to improve performance dramatically. But otherwise, processed foods that are much more easy to digest, more free sugars, more energy dense, those are going to be appropriate before, during, and after training or exercise. Or if someone just needs a lot of calories, like one of those field or special ops schools where just getting in, soldiers have been shown to burn 4,000 to 8,000 calories a day, depending on their body weight and the type of training. In that case, liquid calories, more processed calories are going to be essential to just meeting the energy demands. So briefly, I want to talk about what's used to be called the female athlete triad. Sometimes it's now called the female and male athlete triad, or just the athlete triad. And this is a component of something that's typically used now, which is just called relative energy deficiency in sport. What this means is there's a relative energy deficiency based on needs. Someone could say they eat 3,000 calories a day. That might seem like a lot to someone, but if they're burning 4,000 to 5,000 calories, there's a relative energy deficiency of that 1,000 to 2,000 calories. So someone might be eating a lot, but training even more, and that energy deficit could be quite large. Typically, we see this in females. This is because they generally have a little bit smaller body size. Sometimes there's social pressure to be smaller, and so eating less is a factor in that. And for any individual, if they're smaller in stature, they just need fewer calories. So it's easier to, as a percentage of calories, any small drop is going to be a larger percentage of their overall intake. So large relative energy deficiency for a prolonged period of time, for weeks to especially months, can result in this relative energy deficiency syndrome. And so what we used to classically think of this as the female athlete triad. So to come back to that, there's low energy availability. That will result in hypothalamic amenorrhea. So menstrual cycles stop, because the body tries to conserve calories. And because the menstrual cycle stopped, there's not as much estrogen and bone mineral density can decline. So there's a higher risk for fractures. And so that was kind of the triad. But we've realized that this can also happen in males. Now, males don't have menstrual cycles, but their sexual function, testosterone levels can drop dramatically. It's just not as easy to observe. And it goes beyond just reproductive function. It can affect psychological stress management and focus, other endocrine hormones, thyroid hormone, cortisol, etc. Increased injury risk, reduced musculoskeletal recovery from just the daily training. So there's a great use of overuse injuries. Immune function can decline. So it's really a wide-ranging spectrum of outcomes. And so now in most soldiers, this is not very common with basic training or daily training, but it is more common in soldiers that are going to specialist training schools, like special operations courses. So something to think about for those individuals that have that in mind. All right, protein recommendations. You would think that this would be the easy one to meet, is that people just go, oh yeah, protein's good, I should get more protein. I'm amazed at the number of people that consume suboptimal amounts of protein, and especially the timing of the protein could be improved. So here's a general overview of protein needs. If someone is recreational or lightly active, you're a weekend warrior but doesn't do a whole lot during the week, maybe up to 1 gram per kilogram of body weight of protein each day. 0.8 grams per kilogram is the basic RDA for a sedentary individual. Moderate endurance training, there's no real strength training, but they are still damaging the muscles a little bit and using some protein during those longer runs. So a little bit of an increase is helpful. Now, if you have someone who's doing marathons or kind of ultra running, they actually might be really high up in that top category, that intense training. But otherwise, strength training, because there's more muscle damage, they need a little bit more protein, 1.4 to 1.7 grams per kilogram. And then if you have any kind of intense strength training or any kind of combined training, then so that's going to be some strength training. You got basic conditioning. You're also running. Maybe you're rucking in there, and you're putting in a lot of hours. Then up to 2.2 grams per kilogram, which nicely is just 1 gram per pound of body weight, is ideal. So within the spectrum, how do you know you should be at the higher end of any given range, or which range you should be in? If there's more intense training, more frequent training, newer training stimuli, or if someone is in a calorie deficit. So if someone is trying to lose a little bit of weight, then we want to make sure that they're losing fat mass and not lean body mass, in which case it helps to have extra protein to offset the loss in lean body mass, so that any weight loss is more likely to come from body fat. And this is especially true if someone is more fit, more muscular, and leaner. So all of these principles become more impactful as an individual goes to the extremes of performance or body composition. Some other benefits of a high protein diet is that if someone is going to overeat on calories, protein generally isn't stored as fat. It's really difficult for the body to do that energetically. Higher protein diets also reduce hunger, which is why most successful weight loss diets are higher in protein, regardless of the carbohydrate or fat content. So if someone is going to eat protein, it's just easier to eat less if that's a goal of theirs. For people that are, another consideration is people on a higher protein diet, if they do need, say, 4,000+ calories per day, and they're getting a high protein diet, they also just may have to, instead of eating to hunger, purposefully eat more calories than they need or than they want, just to make sure that they're meeting their energy demands. But the most recent research and reviews on protein intake and distribution show that basically that 1.6 grams per day. So if we go back, that's that very top category, 1.6 to 2.2, especially split over 4 meals, is going to be optimal for most athletes that are doing kind of almost like a multi-sport training. So some conditioning, running, as well as strength training. So for most soldiers, that's probably where they need to be, is 1.6 up to 2.2, depending on their body composition and their fitness level. So for most people, this is about 30 grams per meal 4 times a day. If someone has breakfast, lunch, and dinner, then that means snacks need to be a little bit higher protein. A lot of people disregard snacks so they look at good protein sources, good food quality in meals, say breakfast, lunch, dinner, but then snacks are maybe a bag of chips where there's basically no protein in there, candy bar, Gatorade. And so I usually tell people trying to have snacks be about 8 grams of protein and about 3 grams of fiber. That'll make sure that it's a good source of both protein, but also food quality. That could be something like peanut butter and celery or a piece of fruit. It could be a glass of milk with pretty much anything else, granola bar, or even a bag of chips, some yogurt and fruit. Even some leftovers, small piece of meat or some beef jerky, can of tuna with something. So these are things that can really help people meet their overall daily protein goals. Also, would be the distribution of protein throughout the day. So if you see here on the top, on the left, that's the optimal protein distribution. Depending on body size, about 20 to 30 grams, depending on body size. So females and smaller males might be more towards the lower end of the spectrum, 20 grams, whereas a larger individual might be 30 to even 35 grams to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So more than that, then there's not as much benefit, but less than that, and they may not be optimally recovering for that meal period. So you're going to get greater daily muscle protein synthesis by splitting up your protein into at least, say 30 or so gram meals. So in this example, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Whereas what most people do is they have a small breakfast, maybe just a snack. Some people skip it entirely. They have a moderate lunch, or maybe the lunch has a lot of calories, but it's more processed food. They're eating out, and so they're just less likely to get enough protein. And then at dinner, they have a big piece of meat, maybe they cook a meal themselves, and that's where they get the most protein throughout the day. So in each of these examples, there's the same total daily protein intake, but that skewed protein towards the evening with less in the morning, especially if people are active first thing in the morning, is not going to provide optimal muscle protein synthesis and adaptation and recovery for any given training day. And then we look at the bottom. There's this great paper that looked at an equivalent amount of protein as either 2 40-gram protein meals, 4 20-gram protein meals, or 8 meals with 10 grams of protein each. The best one here was the one in the middle. That had the greatest muscle protein synthesis and out of all 3 groups. And the reason is at the bottom, we're not optimally, if we're just having that small amount of protein, we're not optimally stimulating muscle protein synthesis, and being too frequent might be an issue. This is because of the refractory period between protein feedings that is needed to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So if you consume a big bolus of protein and you maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis, you went from a low amount of amino acids in your blood to having that protein intake, and your blood amino acids spike, and that change in amino acids signals to the body, let's repair and recover. You need about 3 hours for that to come back down to resensitize the body and the muscles so that when they see another spike in amino acids in the blood, they can once again increase muscle protein synthesis. If you keep blood levels of amino acids too consistent throughout the day because you're eating too frequently and small amounts of protein, you're not optimally stimulating that signal for muscle protein synthesis. And if we go up to the top, that 40 grams twice a day, once you get too far over this maximum protein synthesis, there's not really much additional benefit. And if you only have 2 of those, then you're missing out on that intermeal time that might be, say, 6 hours between meals where you could have re-stimulated that muscle protein synthesis. So for most individuals, that 3 to 4 meals per day, maybe with 1 or 2 snacks, is going to be optimal for overall recovery. On animal protein versus plant protein, there's a lot of interest in plant-based diets, and that can be fine. If someone is consuming multiple sources of plant protein within about a 6-hour period, so between 2 meals, so pretty much if they're eating various plant-based protein throughout the day, they're going to be fine. There's some evidence that, if you only are eating a single source of plant protein, which is very difficult unless someone has, like, say, a scoop of rice protein powder and a piece of fruit, and that's all they're getting for their protein until their next meal, then that might be an issue. But if it were because plant-based proteins are less complete, meaning of the essential amino acids, they're a little bit low on one of them, they're not going to be able to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis as well as a more complete protein. So mixing plant-based proteins or consuming most any animal protein is going to be optimal. So say we want that one is going to be optimal here for our most complete protein. Most of these dairy and meat-based sources are going to be quite good. And once we get into plant-based sources, soy is an exception, but other plant-based sources are going to be a little bit less. So if someone is, peanut butter plus bread, you kind of get the different, the wheat protein and the legume protein, and it kind of evens out. So for most people, I say it's not that big of a deal. And the research shows that assuming you're on a plant-based diet, but meeting your daily protein needs, which is, pretty decent amount for most people, it's more than they think, then they're probably fine. This is something that if you want to reference back to it, you can. Just something I usually hand out to some of the tactical athletes I work with, that kind of here's 25 grams of protein at each major meal. You should be getting one of these, and as a snack, you can add another one somewhere. You do this 4 or 5 times a day, and you're pretty much going to meet your protein goals without really thinking about it too much. So let's quickly go through some carbohydrate recommendations. The big thing with carbohydrates and why they're emphasized with athletes is that prolonged activities and high intensity activities require carbohydrates. As the exercise intensity goes from a walk, jog, run to sprint, we are relying on carbohydrates more and more. So if you're max out sprinting or doing some strength training, you are almost 100% relying on carbohydrates to fuel that activity. Right now, if you're just kind of sitting or standing there, you are going to be burning quite a bit of fat. If you just go for a walk, you're still burning quite a bit of fat. But even if you go for like a moderate run, you're kind of half and half carbs and fats. But if you do it long enough, you're still going to use up enough carbohydrates that your stored carbohydrate as glycogen is going to be depleted and performance can suffer. So athletes that are doing more sprint intervals, circuit training, or longer runs, even a long ruck with the pack on, the intensity goes up quite a bit. Carbohydrates are going to be essential. So here are the generally recommended ranges for carbohydrate intakes as grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. So 5 is usually considered the minimum for most even light-based athletes, but any kind of skill training, you pretty much don't need a whole lot of carbohydrates each day. Most people tend to fall within the 5, maybe 6 per day if they're eating a normal diet. Moderate intensity training, fairly laid back, but up to an hour a day, 5 to 6 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram. This is especially true with just light running, maybe some very light or low effort kind of strength training. When you start getting into more intense training, even an hour, but especially up to 3 hours per day, these are athletes that when they do work out, they're putting in a lot more effort, or they are doing combined endurance and strength training. So for a lot of individuals that are even just doing standard PT, but they're actually getting after it, so to speak, they may be in that moderate to high intensity range. People that are doing extra workouts after work or stuff on the weekend, they're definitely going to be up there. When you start getting into like extended activities, or anyone doing especially long distance running, kind of marathon running, then you're looking at really high levels of carbohydrates. But most people are going to be in one of these 2 middle categories. This translates to, if someone is 140 or 200 pounds, they might need, that 350 or so, maybe upwards of 500 grams of carbohydrates per day. And if they're in this moderate to high intensity training, those same individuals might need, 400 to 500, up to maybe 600 to 700 grams per day. So per meal, we're looking at, depending on the individual, maybe 80 to 120, maybe 100 to 150 grams per meal. So keep that in mind as we look at this chart. I give this to athletes and I say, you need 100 grams of carbohydrates at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or maybe you take some out because you have some snacks. So pick 3 of these and put them in a meal. And so, you've got 1.5 slices of bread, so you can have 4 to 5 slices of bread. You can have, basically 2 to 2.5 cups of pasta, cup and a half of rice, and 3 bananas, and that's in addition to their protein source and any fat source they might have. So especially if it's more whole food, it's harder to get the calorie density in, but it does necessitate eating usually a lot more than they expect, especially if they're used to eating less volume of more processed food, but then they start eating higher quality food that just takes up more space because it's not as processed. They're not used to eating the volume. So for a lot of athletes, it's a transition to eating enough carbohydrates, especially of healthier food. And I had to put this in there. Are carbs fattening? I do get this question, and I get this, there's a fear because a lot of the kind of popular media says low carb is better and carbs are fattening. So if we look on the left, those are all carbohydrate sources, more whole food carbohydrates. And you look on the right, those are more processed foods. The difference is on the right, each of those foods is about 50% fat, 50% carbohydrates. By deep frying it, by adding extra oils, or just kind of the fats that are in some of the toppings, that can basically double the calorie content. So it's 50% fat, 50% carbs. Carbs are not fattening, calories are fattening if we consume too many of them. So a lot of people, they have to get in this mindset of shifting from those processed, added sugar, added oil carbohydrates to eating more whole foods. And you can still add fat, that's fine, but make sure that we're getting enough carbohydrates. And if we see here down at the bottom, this is a take home that a lot of athletes with high energy expenditure and high intensity training have to get used to, is that some athletes have to need a slightly lower fat diet in order to ensure optimal carbohydrate intake without going overboard on calories. Now, if I said you need 500 to 600 grams of carbohydrates per day, and you get it from foods there on the right, you're going to get a lot of extra calories as fat, and you're going to gain weight. But if you eat those carbohydrates from the foods on the left, then the overall energy intake is going to be where you need it to be, but you're still getting a high carb intake. So in-season athletes, or for military, people going through more intense phases of training or special operations school, training for that, or they just have a really high energy workout program, then generally speaking, a little bit lower fat, higher carb diet is necessary. All right, let's hop into recommendations. Not a whole lot here. Usually as sports nutritionists, we say, what's your energy need? Let's look at your protein for recovery, your carbohydrates for fueling, and then whatever extra calories you have them as fat. So adding fat to the diet doesn't necessarily help performance, but we do want to enjoy our diets, and we need fat for just general health. So the basic recommendations are, the basic dietary recommendations are 20 to 35% of total calories as fat. An athlete may be on the lower end of that if they have a higher carb intake, but usually 1 gram of fat per kilogram of body weight as fat is usually appropriate for most athletes. They can go higher if they want. If you go lower, sometimes there's some health issues depending on the food choices. So I don't like to focus too much on ketogenic diets unless someone has a specific interest, but I have a section here on this because a lot of people ask, what about keto or low carb? And there's some really interesting research coming out in the past 5 years about, the potential for kind of getting fat adapted and having some benefit for especially endurance training. So let's talk a little bit about ketogenic diets. Most people are familiar with them, but if not, we have a more whole food ketogenic food choices here on the right. Yes, you can just eat bacon and hamburger and cheese and that's it. But yes, you can have plenty of vegetables that are low in carbs, nuts, relatively whole foods, actual meat products instead of more processed meat products. Add the cheeses, some cream, that's fine. But getting in some vegetables is certainly going to be helpful. In general, carbohydrates are maybe 20 to 50 grams per day, depending on the individual, and it's usually about 5% of total calories. There's usually a decent amount of protein, and then about 70% of the calories are coming from fats. Some individuals, if they have a high calorie expenditure and they're on a low carb diet, will do like a fat bomb, like a shake, where they'll just put glug in some olive oil, or they'll eat 2 avocados in one sitting, just things to get extra fat, because one of the things is if you get too much protein, it can interfere with the ketogenic process. But this is a general take. Here's the overall summary of how it affects performance. Ketogenic and low-carb diets can improve the ability to metabolize fat at any intensity, other than like the maximum sprinting. If you're even at a relatively high or moderate intensity, you will start to burn more fat to fuel that activity if you're consuming more fat in your diet and less carbohydrates. The unfortunate consequence is that the body becomes less able to metabolize carbohydrates. The enzymes and metabolic pathways for using carbohydrates, since it's not utilized as much because you're not consuming as much carbohydrate, it becomes more difficult then to, when you do consume carbs, to then tap into that as an energy source. So we'll come back to that here. So this might be helpful for improving moderate intensity endurance, but anything really high intensity, sprinting intervals, maybe strength training with low rest periods, the performance can drop moderately or quite a bit depending on the individual. So we have some research that's looked at low carb, high fat diets and overall exercise economy and can it help? So in general, they find that intermittent and high intensity activities are going to suffer unless they have a high carbohydrate availability, which is why a lot of athletes, even endurance runners, because they're running at a high intensity, higher carb diets are going to be very helpful. Depleting carbohydrate stores is going to lead to fatigue, reduced work rates, and that's going to mean less adaptation, less training intensity, lower training duration means less adaptation and lower fitness gains over time. So what some people on ketogenic diets have tried to do is say, I want the benefit of consuming a high fat, low carb diet most of the time, but can I occasionally refeed and include carbohydrates in my diet to kind of top off my glycogen fuel stores for workouts, but then in between workouts still be kind of ketogenic. And so here are a few different variations that athletes have tried to use to do that. So we have our standard ketogenic diet, which is just always high fat, low carb. Cyclic ketogenic diets have periods of higher carb refeeds. Typically there's like a 1 or 2 day high carb refeed, so either like Saturday, Sunday, or like one weekend day and like Wednesday kind of part way, so that you can kind of get a high carb meal or day, and then for 2 to 3 days after that be low carb. Targeted ketogenic diets say I'm going to be low carb all the time, other than maybe right before or during a workout. So imagine you never consume carbohydrates in your normal diet, but you have something like a Gatorade or like a high carb snack food right before or during a workout, so that you can burn those carbohydrates off and have that energy during workouts, but afterwards you're kind of back in that low carb state. There's some benefits to this. If someone wanted to really micromanage their carbohydrate cycling like this, it certainly can help. It really comes down to the individual and their overall energy expenditure and training demands, but overall there is still some reduction in that high intensity performance. So more recently, there's this idea that even though we're fat adapted, that increases our fat utilization, but the high intensity performance suffers. And we know elite athletes are prioritizing a high carb diet, but they're also doing something else. Generally this train low, compete high paradigm, which is to train with low carb availability every so often. And then when you go into competitions or really high intensity workouts, have high carb availability. So basically you're always on a moderate to high carb diet, but once, maybe twice a week, or even for some people just once every other week, go into a moderate intensity, low intensity workout with low carbs. So what might this look like? Imagine you go on an evening run and you deplete your carbohydrate. Now we'll just use like a running paradigm, but any workout here. But say you deplete your carbohydrate stores with an afternoon run or an evening run, then you don't consume carbohydrates. Now, mind you, this is from someone who would consume carbohydrates normally. They just don't refuel the carbohydrates. They go to sleep, they're sleeping low carb, they wake up, they're low carb, they go on a morning run. That run is going to feel terrible because they don't have the carbohydrate stores to fuel them. And while mentally it's difficult, physically you're going to feel like you've already hit the wall from the start. It does force the body to get used to burning fat more than it would otherwise. And that adaptation carries over so that instead of being low carb all the time and occasionally carbing up, it seems to be better to be moderate to high carb all the time and occasionally have training sessions once or twice a week that are low carbohydrate to get those fat adaptation benefits. This is also sometimes called fuel for the work required. If you have a high intensity workout, you should fuel for that. If it's a lower intensity workout or recovery workout, maybe go into it low carb so that you kind of get that fat adaptation. There's one study that's pretty good that looked at, let's actually look at ketogenic diets and military personnel. So they looked at people that were in basic training, I believe. This is across, I think, a few branches. And they basically found that physical performance of these soldiers was maintained on a ketogenic diet, and they lost body mass and body fat. So many individuals coming into basic training, have somewhat low fitness and possibly a little bit extra fat. So for these individuals who are still performing quite well and they're gaining fitness, they're maybe not at like the peak of their physical fitness or body composition, a ketogenic diet can work just fine. So for most individuals, I'd say probably about 70% of people in the military just doing general training and their job is generally active, a ketogenic diet could be fine. Now, those people that are doing more special operations or just they have personal fitness goals that are, they're really at like top of really high intensity performance, ketogenic diet might not work as well for them. But this shows that for the bulk of individuals, a ketogenic diet is just fine because it meets their performance, their goals. Brief thing, if someone is going to switch to a ketogenic diet, just some background, it generally takes 1 to 2 weeks for an initial adaptation to feel a little better. Sometimes they call it the keto flu. You might feel like nausea, some body aches, no concentration, sleeping, and a lot of people say after 1 or 2 weeks, I kind of woke up, started feeling better. Now your body's a little bit better able to use fat. But full fat adaptation takes 1 to 3 months to really get a consistent feel for how it's going to affect you. But again, not something I advocate, but if someone wanted to do this, it is certainly something that is possible. So just to quickly go through some additional things. So we have our energy, carbs, fats, proteins, maybe even a low carb versus high carb diets. Let's look at some other factors that play a role in performance, separate from those things. Digestion and what's called training the gut. A lot of people, especially with prolonged field and sports training sessions, they tend to have lower performance because of gastrointestinal upset. This could be because they're not used to consuming food while being active. So this is what's called training the gut. So if you look here on the left, the various methods. So training with large volumes of fluid or consuming a meal or a larger snack right before training. Now, obviously, do this when you're training, not when you're actually in a field exercise or any kind of competition, but more when it's kind of safe. So if you're just training on your own or you're doing PT and it's like, I'm willing to risk a little GI upset and a sacrificed training intensity, but it's not going to really harm anything, then that'd be the time to do it. So you want to practice nutrition before and during the activity as you would like it to be during the actual event that you want, that you want to be used to consuming those foods. So as an example, we'll just go like running. People run races for fun, 5K or half marathon or whatever. You'll be like, okay, half marathon, I need to fuel up, but they don't do it during training. And then for the first time ever on race day, they go and they suck down some sports gels and Gatorade and all the carbohydrate and fluid. They're not used to it while being active at that intensity, and it really messes up their stomach. So training with those gels and the fluid and even food is going to be very helpful. And this translates to a real world situation. If someone is actually deployed and they need to, quickly be active, they might be in a meal and then, 5 minutes later be doing something intense and prolonged. So to some extent, for those people, training the same way that they might experience in the real world is going to be helpful. Things digestion related. There's something called FODMAPs. So these are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. Basically, various forms of carbohydrates that are difficult to digest. And if we don't digest them, they make their way down further into the GI tract, into the large intestine, where gut bacteria will ferment them and produce gas. So unabsorbed carbohydrates will attract water, and bacteria will ferment the carbohydrates and produce gas. So that's why you can get this kind of watery diarrhea and gas and bloating that comes with eating some of these foods. Unfortunately, a lot of these foods tend to be minimally processed plant-based foods. So here's a list of foods that are higher in FODMAPs. And various people are more or less sensitive to these. So this is not a universal concept. It could just be a few of these for some people, or some people are more sensitive to all of them. So certain fruits are a little bit higher in fructose or fructans, lactose. A lot of people are lactose intolerant. Various polyols. So especially things, like certain dried fruits like apricots and plums, pears, things a little, and any kind of sugar alcohol that might be added to food, usually like this all, so maltitol, xylitol, mannitol. A lot of these are not easily digested. Garlic, onions, for some people, wheat and rye. So it may not be that they're gluten intolerant. Maybe it's the FODMAPs in those grain products, especially if they're more whole grains. So for some people, I've noticed some people are like, hey, I can handle fruits and vegetables okay, but fiber and certain carbohydrates from grains, not as much, or vice versa. So finding what works well through an elimination diet can really help someone still eat more minimally processed foods, but identify those ones that aren't going to work for them. I also want to point out this, a lot of health foods, I'll come back to this in a moment, have added fibers as inulin or chicory root, and those are especially difficult to digest and can cause some IBS type symptoms. This is just a reference, so if anybody wants to kind of go back and print this, this is a good resource for foods that are high in FODMAPs to try to cut back. And here is a list of things that are lower in FODMAPs that maybe you could try to supplement your diet with instead. So here's a great example of, I usually focus on sports foods, but this is a good example of just kind of a quote health food. It's a brownie that's being advertised as low in sugar, 2 grams of sugar for a brownie, high in fiber. So how does it get 6 grams of fiber? They add chicory root extract, and that's the source of fiber. That's a lot of chicory root that's already difficult to digest. So if someone has one of these high fiber granola bars or high fiber brownies, or especially like protein bars or things that are trying to be marketed for health, it can cause some GI upset because of the type of fiber that's added. It's not naturally occurring fiber, but added fibers that are difficult to digest. And then low sugar. But how do we get low sugar? A lot of times they'll add something like sugar alcohols. Things that end in -ol. So erythritol, now this one is actually fairly easy to digest. It's used more often because of that. But other things like sorbitol, maltitol are very difficult for us to absorb, and they can cause some gas and bloating. And add in the high fiber and high sugar alcohols that, this product is kind of a double whammy here. So a lot of foods marketed for health can cause GI upsets because of what they add to it. Unfortunately, people say, I'm going to go on a healthy diet and I'm going to make better choices. And then they eat stuff like this and they go, I felt terrible and it didn't work for me. So I'm just going to stop and go back to eating the more processed food. So just something to think about for those individuals. It may not be the healthy food in general, but maybe 1 or 2 ingredients that are added. All right. So nutrient timing, and I'm going to focus more on post-exercise period. So nutrient timing in general can be anything before, during, after workouts. There's some really interesting things where like certain supplements, where if you supplement like calcium, for example, if you take a calcium supplement and then as you absorb it, your blood calcium levels rise, that would be the time to do impact exercise so that the calcium is available to be integrated. So there's some really interesting stuff about, timing of supplements and nutrients to maximize recovery and performance. But because this is only an hour, I'm going to talk mostly about the post-exercise period, since most people talk about this, kind of post-workout nutrition. So in general, this is the way to think about it. And this is for the military, actually. They have a bunch of great resources. If you look up HPRC, they have some really good performance nutrition resources. So in general, did you exercise at a moderate to high intensity? If not, follow your usual eating pattern. You probably didn't exercise intensely enough to necessitate optimal recovery and refueling. So moderate workout, high intensity, sure. Is your next meal in more than 2 hours? Meaning you have a long stretch of time between the workout and eating, then yeah, maybe something more of a snack, a post-workout recovery specific nutrition is going to be helpful. If you have a meal in like 2 hours, especially like some people, they work out and then like they get off work, they work out and then immediately eat dinner. They don't necessarily need like a post-workout protein shake or something right before eating dinner that's going to be maybe 30 minutes later. The idea though, we just don't want to go too long between our workout and consuming some nutrition. What might that post-workout nutrition look like within that first, say, 30 to 60 minutes? Generally speaking, depending on the individual, 50, maybe even 100 grams of carbohydrates to optimally recover muscle glycogen so they're ready to go for that next workout. And then 15 to 30 grams of protein, maybe even up to 35, 40 for very large muscular individuals. But the amount depends on someone's lean body mass. More muscular, you're going to need more protein. And then rehydrate is for every pound loss, you need basically, 20, 24 ounces of water. So we're looking at, maybe 3 to 4 cups of water per pound lost. And that's a good way to know if you're hydrated, especially after workout, is just looking at your urine. People say, how many cups, how much water should I drink per day? Well, maybe you eat a lot of fruits and veggies that has water in it already. You don't need to drink as much. Maybe you're more active. You need to, you're sweating more. Some people sweat more than others for the same workout. So there are ways to go about it a little more, specifically if someone's interested in that. But otherwise, we usually say make sure that your urine is a pale yellow or a little bit lighter. If you start getting darker, there's more solutes in there. You probably need to drink a little bit more water. So back to this post-workout period. Sometimes this is called the anabolic window because stimulating muscles through exercise makes them more able to take up carbohydrates and proteins, those amino acids, and you're more likely to have a greater muscle protein synthesis and glycogen resynthesis response in that immediate 30 to 60 minute post-workout window. So the anabolic window is helpful to recover more than you would otherwise by waiting, delaying that nutrition. But also there's some evidence that consuming nutrients either immediately before or immediately after a workout can help reduce post-exercise inflammation. So you're better able to come back and exercise at a high performance level earlier. So it accelerates that actual recovery of performance. This is especially important if someone is doing 2-a-day workouts. Or they work out in the evening and there's, they're gonna work out again the next morning. So there's less than 24 hours between workouts. If you're especially getting like that 8 to 10 hour window between workouts, then the post-workout nutrition becomes much more important. A consideration is this third point here. If you have a meal before working out, you'll absorb the carbohydrates and proteins, those amino acids, into your bloodstream, and they'll circulate for a few hours. If you're exercising while those nutrients are circulating, then they already have nutrients to absorb, and the post-workout nutrition isn't going to add much to that. So post-workout recovery nutrition is really important if someone is going into a workout fasted. So if it's like they wake up, they don't eat anything, they work out first thing in the morning, then they eat, that post-workout nutrition is very crucial. If they had lunch, they work out an hour later, they can wait, another hour or 2, 3 before having an additional meal, and that's not going to impair their overall recovery. So usually we say, if you've got, your pre and post exercise meals, if they're more than 4 hours apart, wherever your workout is, so it's 4 hours apart, you ate a meal, you wait 2 hours, work out, you wait 2 hours and eat. That might be like a lunch and dinner thing, like that's fine. But if it starts going beyond that 4 hours between those 2 meals, then the post-workout or pre-workout exercise nutrition is going to be more important. This bottom point is going to be important, is that this specific nutrient timing it's much more important when athletes are already underfueled, if they are glycogen depleted from a previous workout, if they're managing their energy intake more tightly, like for example, they are really trying to watch their body composition and they're kind of just eating enough but not too much, multiple daily workouts, or if they have really high performance levels because they're going to burn through fuel more quickly. So as people reach these extremes of diet or physiology, some of these principles are much more important. All right, so real quick, I'm going to finish with supplements. I like to just give a short list of supplements because this is pretty much all that works. These are for performance enhancement. There are some, if you want to look at like weight loss or sleep or other things, but this is more just direct performance enhancement supplements. I'm going to start by saying that Operation Supplement Safety is run by the DoD. There's a great website with resources to say, is this supplement allowed for soldiers? Many things are banned. It's also a safe thing. They pretty much follow the same collegiate and elite level kind of banned substances. So if a supplement has this informed choice or NSF certified label, then that specific product has been shown to have what's actually on the label. There's no other metabolites or other ingredients that might sneak in that might cause someone to fail a banned substances test. Okay, so caffeine. Caffeine is very effective for delaying fatigue. It reduces perceived exertion so that someone is able to exercise a little bit longer, a little bit harder. Obviously, we build up a tolerance to caffeine very quickly, so abusing caffeine can reduce its effectiveness somewhat. Creatine is great for especially kind of like sprinting, strength training. It doesn't make someone stronger, but it allows them to exercise at that 100% effort for a little bit longer. So instead of, say, getting 10 reps on a max bench press for 10, they might be able to get 11 or 12. So more training stimulus, more training adaptation, and that can lead to strength gains and muscle hypertrophy gains over time. Beta-alanine is a buffer, basically augments the lactate buffer system so that those intermediate sprinting, like say I'm going to sprint for 30 to 60 seconds, 2 minutes, those kinds of things are going to be enhanced with beta-alanine. Vitamin D is going to be helpful in general, assuming someone does not get enough UV exposure or they don't make their own vitamin D levels. They don't make enough vitamin D to get themselves in an optimal range. Vitamin D deficiency can result in suppressed immune function, reduced bone mineral metabolism, so bone mineral density can decline, muscle metabolism for a little bit of energy metabolism, but also especially just actual structural recovery, and cardiovascular health. So kind of across the board, vitamin D has been shown to be very helpful for athletic and health performance. And then any kind of, now we're getting into like food stuff. So, protein supplements or any other kind of convenience foods. These just help people get in their daily intake of carbs, fats, proteins, or maybe they're easier to digest. It's great for travel nutrition. But it is possible for most athletes with a well-planned diet to use whole foods without protein or carbohydrate supplements, other than maybe during a long training session. And then some more fringe things. So for endurance, this is more for like long distance, like marathon level stuff. Sodium bicarbonate, because it's more of an acid-based buffer, and then nitrates can help endurance performance. And then other convenience foods we kind of mentioned. One thing I will say is that, so this is the front and back page of the handout from the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee for their nutrients for soft tissue recovery. They have some pretty good stuff on here. I do want to basically say eat whole foods, things are going to reduce inflammation, but I want to point out a few things. Right here, if someone's injured, they're not going to be as active if they take some downtime. Those individuals may need to eat a little bit less in the way of calories because their training demand dropped. A lot of people that get injured tend to gain weight because they don't modify their diet. Also, they want to make sure that not only are they eating less, but they make sure that they are still consuming an adequate amount of protein, because that injured tissue still needs some protein at that higher level that they're used to recover. The second thing I want to point out is this vitamin C in gelatin. There's a lot of really interesting research over the past 5 years about using this protocol for especially tendon-related injuries. So things, a little bit of connective tissue, especially tendons, ligaments. These are made of collagen. So if we consume gelatin or Hydrolyzed collagen is basically the same thing as gelatin, but gelatin makes that stiff jello type, we know what jello is. Collagen is the same thing, but because it's hydrolyzed and processed, it's more water soluble, so you just stir it in some water. They both seem to have the same effects for this protocol. And then vitamin C plays a role in stimulating collagen deposition in connective tissue. So consuming a small amount of vitamin C and 10 to 15 grams of gelatin or hydrolyzed collagen an hour, maybe 45 minutes to an hour before activity can really help accelerate the rehab and recovery of those soft tissue injuries. The reason for this is we want to consume it 45 to 60 minutes before the activity so that we have time to digest it and absorb those nutrients in our bloodstream. And as those nutrients peak in our bloodstream, we activate our muscles and we strain our ligaments and tendons, and those nutrients are already available to be integrated into those tissues as they're exercising. So this protocol is not as effective if you just take gelatin, vitamin C, and sit on the couch. So this has been shown to accelerate tendon and ligament repair. It's a small benefit, but it is significant enough that even U.S. Olympic Committee and other teams have started to recommend this as a standard protocol for recovery. Last slide here. Yes, there are Bang energy drinks and many other energy drinks throughout bases, pre-workout supplements as well. I'm not going to get on here about caffeine. What I want to focus on is this top strip here. So on the can label, and there's nothing specific about Bang, it's just an example. Many products are this way. They advertise multiple ingredients to help performance. Branched chain amino acids, creatine, and coenzyme Q10. Each of these can actually have some ergogenic benefit to help performance, but if we look at where they are on the label, there's only, they're far enough down that if we actually kind of do the math, there's a little bit less, there's at least less than how much vitamin C is in here, which is about 45 milligrams. You need grams of BCAAs, grams of creatine to have any effect, but there are milligram levels in here. And coenzyme Q10, we're probably looking at maybe 10% of the effective dose as well. So they can advertise these things as being in the product, but they don't tell you how much. And a lot of people go, hey, cool, I'm getting an energy drink, I might as well buy this one, or I'm getting a pre-workout supplement, so I might as well buy this one because it has all the things in it. So what I would suggest is that if you do want to take these supplements, make sure you get one that actually tells you how much of any given additive is in there, and then compare it to what an actual effective dose would be, or just buy creatine separately, buy BCAAs separately, and then consume your caffeine in any form that you want. So just something to keep in mind when you're navigating the multi-ingredient supplement market out there. So that is what I have for an overview of what most people will find helpful for performance nutrition. So if anybody has any questions, I would be glad to answer anything. I see one question published here. Why does it seem like high fat or high sugar foods more desirable than fresh whole foods? Without going into a lot of detail, I will reference you to my presentation yesterday morning where I went into that in quite a bit of detail, and there's some good references there. And for anybody who's interested, the PowerPoint slides, the notes for each slide have references to what was on the slide. So if you want any more information or download something, that's there for you. So high fat, high sugar foods, especially if they're really processed, because we absorb the nutrients very rapidly and we get that spike of energy, they kind of stimulate our palate, and we get that spike of nutrients in our blood so quickly that they drive reward pathways, and they're very, what the industry calls hyper palatable. They're tasty, but they're overly tasty, and they activate our reward systems almost like a drug would. And so if we eat those foods regularly enough, we habituate ourselves to it, and they become normal. And then we seek those foods out because less processed foods tend not to be as exciting to our brain anymore. So that's one thing. It's very complex, but that's kind of my overview for that. Otherwise, that's the only question I have. If you got any other questions, feel free to drop a message here if you watch the video later or something comes to mind. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the presentation.